Hi, we continue in Genesis 30 today as Jacob's 4 women have provided him with 11 sons and a daughter, and now when Rachel, the one he wanted in the first place, has finally born a child of her own body, Joseph, Jacob says to Laban, "It's time to send me away." So as the story shifts, we're going to begin to see the other side of the chiasm here. As you can see on the right side of the screen, the basic structure of the entire Jacob story puts us in the center section with Jacob and Laban. And now we're in this section here, parallel to the first part of the 2 wives story, where Laban deceived Jacob about Leah and Rachel. And now we see in the chiastic structure how this is exactly parallel. So in the scene we're beginning to look at here, it's parallel to the one up here. And whereas Jacob was naive there and got tricked by Laban, Jacob's prepared now 20 years later for Laban's trickery and has his own tricks in mind, more than one, as we'll see. So as we've been looking at this, we've been reading it at these 3 levels, and it's really important today and in the next part of this unit here, as Jacob will have an experience of Yahweh telling him to return to the land, your place, and to your land, which is certainly a message to the exilic and post-exilic community, as well as to the character in the story, and as well as to the 2 nations that were in Rebekah's womb, about to become Israel, and then Esau as Edom, which we'll see on the other part, the last of the 3rd part of the Jacob cycle. So all 3 of these elements of reading levels are relevant here, and we'll see how they play out as we go. A couple of other things in the background, not so much relevant for our immediate scene, are the parallels with the wife-sister stories that we've been looking at, and I won't go over that in detail now. But also important, especially in the next scene, as we'll see in these elements here, are key pieces of how we're reading this story of Laban and his daughters as an allegory of the monarchy and exile. And we'll see next time how Jacob, inspired to return, is parallel to Israel returning to the land of its ancestry after Solomon's son Rehoboam doesn't understand how to hold the 2 pieces together, as well as the exilic community coming out of Babylon. So we'll see next time how that's all at one level. And as we look into this scene here that involves Jacob trying to trick Laban into letting him go by having a little ruse about the colors of cattle, about sheep and goats. Many older scholars have seen that as some kind of expression of an ancient magical view and such, and I've never bought into that, based on the idea that the original audience, whether that's in the time of the story world in the 2nd millennium BCE or in the time of exile and post-exile in the 5th or 6th century BCE, would know way better than a modern audience that sheep and goats do not turn color based on the color of sticks that are in their watering troughs. They would recognize that immediately, and that would have no value. Folks who have to depend on nature working according to patterns they can recognize, and certainly that's not one. So fortunately, recently, the wonderful scholar Songmi Susie Park has written this wonderful piece here in 2010 that explains the symbolism of this story over against older scholars who tried to show, often with an implicit bit of anti-Semitism, that the ancient authors weren't very smart and believed in magical kinds of things. So as we look at the key words for our passage, there are a number of word plays that we'll see coming up, as well as a huge number of unique words or extremely rare words. By rare, I mean they're either only in this scene in Genesis, or perhaps only in this scene in the entire Hebrew Bible, or only here in 1 or 2 other places. And so all the words in Hebrew that are underlined in the English translations here are among those words, including all the descriptions of the wood, as plain and peeled and streaks, etc., as well as the descriptions of the animals as speckled and spotted. And there's a wonderful wordplay that I've tried to highlight with this kind of bold boxing here, is that the word for white in Hebrew is simply Laban. So these are the same word, but it has the name Laban and it has white on it. That's exactly the same. So we could easily see here, everyone had Laban on it, and every lamb was black. And so that's going to be important, as we'll see, as Park notes, and as I've noted also, apart from her, but strengthened with her argument, that what we're seeing here is a description of how, when you come out of exile, when you come out of one cultural context, something is transformed by the encounter. And the question is, how much can you bring with you? And we'll see how that plays out against the extreme attitude of the Ezra and Nehemiah people, who, with Persian cooperation, established a regime for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple after the exile by saying no mixing at all. Any foreign wives wives are prohibited, and any children of foreign wives that already exist must be cast out. So they understood it as some kind of pure ethnicity. And yet, in our context, there is no pure ethnicity, because as I've noted, Jacob and his family are not Jews and they're not Israelites. Only his children will become the Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel. So what we're seeing is what anthropologists call ethnogenesis, a story for the creation of a new ethnicity separate from the Mesopotamians, and that may play out also against the monarchical story of the relationship between Judah and Israel. Are they one ethnicity, one nation, if you will, or two? So those are some of the underlying issues that we'll see as we go through this, through word plays and other thematic elements. So with nothing further ado, let's just jump right in. So as we see right away from this verse, when Rachel had borne Joseph, we see in my note below from the Midrash, interpreting this with Jeremiah 49:20, saying, "Surely the youngest of the flock shall drag them away," contrary to the translation, shall be dragged away, or shall be sent away here, to say that Edom and Esau will fall at the hand of Joseph, the youngest of the flock. In other words, they're understanding this exactly at the point I was saying, that middle level, as the two nations in your womb. Strine, interestingly, recently interprets this through migration studies, noting the seeking independence and return to his homeland. And I'd really like to focus on that as we go, because we've been seeing all along that Jacob is a migrant. He's a refugee sent away from his homeland by his parents and sent alone to this strange place. And although there's family there, he's never met them, and they've never met him, of course. And now 20 years later, he's trying to escape, and it's not going to be that easy. So we'll see why that is in just a moment. So Jacob said to Laban, and this is the first time we've seen him speak since chapter 30 and the question about the wives, and that really highlights the chiastic parallel there. And notice in what he says in these verses, he speaks to him in the imperative. He's not making invitations or offers. He's not saying please, as Laban will do in response, but he's offering imperatives and explaining directly why, with no ado, hoping perhaps that the direct language will result in a direct outcome, but it will not. So his first demand is, send me away. Notice not send us away, not send my whole family away, but first just me. The verb for send away, shalach, here is only here and in 32:27, or in the English 32:26 in the same form, which is the wrestling scene. And so we'll see the connections between this and that. And as I noted in the introductory video to this entire unit of 28:11 to 31:55, we could also extend this unit up to the wrestling story, or really all the way up to chapter 35 if we wanted to. Sarna notes this term, send me away, is a technical term for the manumission of one in service to another. Although there's no formal agreement between Laban and Jacob, as we've seen all along. He simply said, what should your wages be? And as we'll see in a moment, Jacob will tell his wives that your father has cheated me 10 times. So there's no clear agreement, and of course there's no procedure for enforcement in this situation either. So perhaps that's a little too formal on Sarna's conclusion there, but it certainly echoes technical terms. As Wenham notes, he uses the straight imperative without even a please, a somewhat aggressive first move on Jacob's part. And as my note below has, from my own thoughts, the scene echoes the thematic wrestling between Abraham and the Hittites in chapter 23, as we also saw implicitly, although Jacob didn't recognize it, in the bargaining over the wife in the service in the first place. Jacob hadn't noticed that Laban, in saying, it's better I give her to you than to somebody else, did not actually promise to give her to him at all, much like the Hittites saying nobody will refuse you a burial place meant that anybody actually offered to give him a burial place. So Jacob is now prepared for this, as we'll see. So send me away, that I may go not so much to my home and country, to my place and land. And place is important, as opposed to house, buy it, or home. Place is what Laban distinguished as it's not done in this place to give the younger before the older. And we also saw in the Bethel scene that introduced this in the transition from being at home to being in the eastern country, that Jacob discovered that Yahweh was in this place, which he named Bethel, and he didn't know it. So Makom, place, is a key term all the way through this. So send me away that I may go to my place in my country, and now give me my women and my children. And we have to wonder, does that mean 2 or 4? Because we saw that both Zilpah and Bilhah were given as Isha, as women, and yet they also seem to continue to bear the status of maidservants. So it was ambiguous there, which is included, and we'll find out later. My children and my wives and my children, and it's Yalad here, children, not Ben's son, so that it certainly includes Dinah, for whom I have served you. And it's clear here that this is how he understands the deal, that it was an exchange for service for wives and children. And as my note below has, it bitterly recalling the forced deal Laban put upon Jacob with the help of the people of the place. And the word for service here, or serving, is 6 times there and twice here. And as my note below has, the link between place-based power, children, and service anticipates the Exodus struggle to leave Egypt, especially as linked with the use of avodah, which is to say service here. We'll see that next time as the whole pattern throughout the Bible of what the author's Genesis knew of God's call, what I would call out of empire, but here it's simply out of Laban's household. So, give me my wives and let me go the second time, so send me away and let me go. For you know very well the service I have given you. It's not natan here, the word for service. It's really the service with which I have served you. It's the noun and the verb together. And we see the verb form here only in chapter 29 earlier. But it's 3 times in Exodus, again providing that Exodus echo there. And as I've argued repeatedly throughout, Genesis is certainly a more recent text than Exodus, so it would know the Exodus text rather than the other way around. So what is Laban going to say to this? Laban said to him, if you will allow me to say so, which is suddenly very polite. There's a please in there, and as my note has below, suddenly Laban oozes charm. But is that really what's going on here? As Westerman notes, these 2 verses portray in lively fashion Laban's embarrassment, perhaps even surprise. But how can that be, living day to day with Jacob's bitterness over the slavery imposed on him for many years? In other words, can Laban really not know how Jacob's been feeling about his situation all this time? We can't imagine that there's a good relation between the son and his father-in-law after all this time of hard service. And we'll see more of that as we go. So he says, if you allow me to say so, and there's a real controversy over whether it's I learned by divination or something else. There's no verb here for learned, and the word for divination, which is often the word for divination, but Wenham notes it's a link with the Akkadian nahasu, which means to become full or wealthy. So therefore it would come out, if it pleases you, I have grown rich. And he offers that instead of divination, for he says it's unlikely that Laban would have resorted to divination when he was prospering. In other words, that's something that you would do when you were desperate, not something you would do when everything is working. As Sarna notes, to use divination to discover the secret of success would be very anomalous. But as I note below, the usual translation sets up the incident with Laban's teraphim, which we'll see, which otherwise come out of nowhere. Further, he has been prospering, but he knows that Jacob wants out and is trying, at least on the surface, to figure a way to show Jacob he should stay. And so that's what we're going to see here. And then we hear him express it, whether it's wealth or by divination, that Yahweh has blessed me. And this is shocking at every level. Westerman notes one would expect Elohim only based on source elements here, but I would suggest that one would expect is Sin, who is the chief god of fertility, especially for Haran as well as for Ur, from which Abram's father Terah came in the first place. As I was noting in the introductory video, the road from Ur to Haran was known as the path of the moon. So we would expect that, but why he would mention Yahweh as the source of his blessing highlights it that the interpenetration is going both ways. That what we'll see with the colors of the sheep, that the Laban sheep, the white sheep, are becoming spotted and streaked. In other words, they're being transformed. So Laban is being transformed into acknowledging Yahweh as the source of his blessing through Jacob. Does he understand blessing the way I've been suggesting the Genesis authors understand blessing, as fertility and life, or does he understand it as wealth? We heard him express blessed are you of Yahweh back to Abraham's servant in chapter 24 over the camels and the bling. Does he see here the animals as life, or does he see them as being transformed into silver? And that's something we can decide as we go. So he says that Yahweh has blessed me, and Barak here is only here and in verse 30, a few verses down, all the way from 28:14 to 32:1. In other words, in the entire time that Jacob is in the old country, we have to infer blessing from the action, but the characters don't mention it, and the narrator doesn't mention it either. But Laban's conclusion is that Yahweh is blessing him because of Jacob. In other words, that Jacob has some magical power of blessing that makes everything fertile around him. And as a result, he doesn't want to let him go. He thinks that Jacob's like the golden goose, and if he lets him go, there's the end of all the fertility that seems to be oozing out of him. As a note from Anderson, whose monograph on the Jacob story I've referred to a number of times, suggests, the first instance in the text in which the descendants of Abraham are explicitly said to to be a blessing to a foreigner, as of course the initial statement from Yahweh to Abram back in chapter 12 said that the nations will be blessed through you. So we're seeing that here, although the result is that they won't let him go, that they want to keep him around. So it's going to be the trade-off between the fertility of blessing that is apparently attached to Jacob from Yahweh to the freedom that Jacob wants to go back to his own land. So I'll scroll down a little bit so we can see what Laban's response is to this fertility. So he says, name your wages and I will give it. Nakva here, not the usual word for naming. Its primary meaning is pierce, as in boring a hole, but it can also mean wages. It's only here. It's one of those rare words that I was noting earlier. As my note below has, Laban implies that the blessing of Jacob is worth any price except his departure. So name your wages, your sekareka here, and we see that several times in this immediate passage here, and so I've highlighted that as a key word here, and I will give it. But Jacob knows it's not true. Jacob does not trust him, and so he already has another plan in mind, and we're only going to have to see that as we go. Notice how little the narrator intervenes to provide shaping of our experience of the story. It's simply the dialogue between the two of them. So Jacob said to him, you yourself know, and notice it's the second time he's used yada, what Laban knows as the basis for this. You yourself know how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared, or literally what your cattle have become with me. And over here, besides key words, I've tried to translate this as much as I can according to what scholars think is a more literal and more interesting translation that reveals the Hebrew a little more. So it's not about how they've fared, it's how they've become, which is to say they've become many. The generic cattle here, Mikneka here, recalling and contrasting with Jacob's fathers and grandfathers, as we saw, whose cattle wealth became abundant because of Yahweh's blessing. But until now, the blessing has only gone to Jacob. And we note that Jacob was not prepared for any of this. Of course, he was the mama's boy by the tent, and Esau was not a shepherd either. He was a hunter. The parallel would be Cain and Abel there with the hunter and the shepherd, but that's not what Jacob was. But he's become that now after 20 years. And so Jacob continues here. As a man with 12 children, Jacob's understandably concerned with when the blessing will accrue to his own family. So he says, for you had little before I came. Do we know that? How would we believe that Laban had little? He seemed to have flocks, but we don't know how many. We know that Rachel came, was watering them, but we had no sense it was little. As my note below, using me'at, which we saw earlier, as usually an expression of exasperation, it'll be in chapter 43 regarding food, where it suggests an ironic echo which Joseph could say to Pharaoh, as Jacob says here to Laban, that Pharaoh had little before Joseph came. So we'll see how that plays out in the next generation there. Before I came here, literally before I faced you, a theme, here's before I faced you, the face theme will become especially evident in the last third when Jacob prepares to reunite with Esau, and has increased abundantly. Literally has burst out. Peretz here meaning to burst out. So it's not just like me'od, which is greatness, but it anticipates Tamar's son Peretz, meaning to burst out. So you had little, and since I've been here, fertility is just bursting out, and Yahweh has blessed you wherever I turned, or literally through my feet. And that's, of course, suggesting his shepherding there. But now, when shall I provide for my own household? Literally, lebtehe, lebeti, the first reference to a house of Jacob. And we'll see the reference to Laban's household in just a minute. So Laban continues, and he's still making the same offer. What shall I give you? Laban sticks to the issue of price, and as Zakovich suggests, Jacob's speech appears to have tested Laban's patience. But I'd like to suggest it could equally be the other way around, that Jacob knows that Laban is not going to give in, he's not going to let him go, and simply thinks he can buy him off for this magical fertility that seems to attach to Jacob. So Jacob offers this: you shall not give me anything. And anything me'uma here, emphatically underscoring the negative answer. If you'll do this for me, I will again feed your flock and keep it. Now, we know as readers, if we've read ahead, that this is plainly a lie, that Jacob is not going to continue to feed his flock and keep it. He's going to take the moment to get out of Dodge as quickly as he can and not let Laban know about it, which will lead to one of the best chase scenes in the whole Bible. But he says this to suggest that he's letting go of what he had asked earlier, just in the scene, let me go, but he'll stay under this one condition. So we have to see what the condition is. So I will again feed your flock and keep it. And This is using return. I'll return to feeding your flock, anticipating the double use of return that we'll see in the next scene. Feed your flock and keep it. Eshmor recalling the commission to Adam in 2:15 to tend or keep the garden. So here's what he offers, and I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of our little passage here. Let me pass through all your flock, evor, literally let me Hebrew, using the Hebrew word for passing through all your flock today, removing or literally turning aside, as Lot suggested the visitors would turn aside from the square and come to his house in chapter 19, every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb. So all these words are rare words here, but they're also word plays. Naquid here, as we'll see the play it has with other words in the passage, but only in this passage in the entire Masoretic text, the entire Hebrew Bible. And the spotted as well, talu, only 2 other examples outside this scene. And curiously, the color black or dark brown only in this scene in the entire Hebrew Bible in these verses. And as Park notes, the semantic and phonetic connections among the word here, hum, and hamet, to become warm or hot, and yicham, to be in heat, as part of the wider wordplay element of the deception. So the fact that he can do word plays here is suggesting also that he can be playful with the sheep themselves. And so such shall be my wages. And so what we're seeing here is, of course, these are genetically, as we would say, unlikely, that it's much more common that sheep would be white and that the spotted and black and speckled ones would be the unusual ones. So it sounds to Laban like Jacob's just giving the store away. Can Laban really believe that Jacob is that stupid as to say, I'll take the ones that, for example, that are only left-handed and, whatever other genetic exceptions we can think of, and that there's not something else going on? But Laban seems to fall for it. But Jacob's not done making his proposal yet. So he says, my innocence here, tzaddik, not so much honesty as innocence, will answer for me later, or literally in the day tomorrow, when you come to look into my wages with you. And again, the face thing, when you come to face my wages with you, everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted as stolen. The first of 40 times in the Masoretic text, 12 times in Genesis, and 9 from here to 31:39. So it'll really be a theme coming up. It's not a key word in our immediate section, but it will be in what's coming. And Laban says, good, or literally hen, lo, let it be as you have said. And as my note here is, Jacob's apparent willingness to settle for the less common colored animals appeals to Laban, who snaps up the offer, not knowing how clever Jacob is. And as my note below has no time for the arrangement is named, and although we'll see next time it starts with that day, what we're seeing in this next scene plainly has to take place over several seasons of development of the breeding of the animals for it to result in what it will result in, which is Jacob becoming extremely rich. But we'll have to see how that happens next time. So stay tuned and we'll see what the rest of Jacob's trick is about next time. See you for that. Bye-bye.